Well, as we're reminded in all the readings today, the Lord comes to heal us. In his own time, of course, he healed people who were physically ill. Often it was blindness, and he cured that. Or as we see mentioned also in the psalm in the first reading today, the deafness and the impediment in the speech. Of course, today we understand better that if a person is deaf, especially from birth, well, then that's why they have difficulty speaking. The two go together, and of course we have wonderful new resources like signing to help with that. So the physical, addressing the physical is important, obviously, but there's also the spiritual dimension to all of these things. And we who have the gift of sight and hearing and speech, in the physical level, need to address also the spiritual dimension. And of course, that comes up, I think, probably most clearly in the gospel in terms of blindness. There's that famous passage after Jesus cures the man born blind in the 9th chapter of John, as we read during Lent. The Pharisees say, "So are we blind?" And Jesus says, "Well, if you were blind, you wouldn't have any fault, but you go around saying we see, and so your guilt remains." See, that's the worst part of it. We can think we see clearly and hear clearly and all that, but we're really blind and we don't know it. So that's the first thing we have to ask the Lord. Lord, cure my blindness, especially the blindness I don't know I have. You're blind to your blindness. But today, of course, in the gospel, etc., the emphasis on this is on deafness. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And all of these failures to perceive more deeply and to hear and to see, what's the source of it? Well, I think the second reading today from James, this famous passage about, whom we welcome into our assembly, and of course this is very timely and contemporary. If someone comes in, as it says, with rings on the fingers and with fancy clothes, and then, oh, come right up here, But then, a homeless man comes in, a poor person comes in, and we say, uh-oh, what's going to happen now? Let him stand in the back or whatever. Well, are we seeing? Do we really perceive? Do we hear? Are we making, as St. James says in the letter, are we being respecters of persons, showing preferences based on superficial standards? Since when is the wealthy person a good person, and since when is the homeless person a bad person, which is what we're basically saying. Then, of course, the wealthy person can make donations, and so we adapt to his politics and all of this stuff that gets us into trouble. Because really seeing into the heart of a person, well, then we exercise just not only discernment, but compassion. We see the presence of God, that radiance of the soul, of the individual person, which is the same in everyone. It doesn't matter what the external circumstances are. We have to see beyond the superficial dimension. So in terms of hearing, what are we listening to? What are we hearing? With all the social media around and all the things we can stream and listen to and, and follow on our phones and the radio, the TV, whatever it is, is it just this constant babble that's bombarding us? And what are we listening to? How twisted and, partisan is it? And how accurate is it? Is it just confirming our blind spots and our prejudices and our preferences? And what's the tone of it? What are we listening to? Is it poisoning our heart? Is it filling us with anger and hatred and suspicion and paranoia, etc.? What are we listening to and how are we hearing it? We have to go down into a deeper place where there's silence, if we can get there. In our hearts, we don't hear with our ears so much as our hearts. Jesus often says in the scriptures, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. St. Augustine remarks in one of his sermons, well, so who didn't have ears? What do you mean whoever has ears? They all have ears. Well, no, they don't. Do we really have ears to hear? To hear what? Well, what's most deeply being expressed? What is the truth of any situation? What's behind all the things that are being said and how they're being said? And what should our reaction be to it? So if we go down to a silent enough place, we actually hear with our hearts. That's our greatest organ of perception, is our heart. Are we hearing deep enough with our heart? And what do we hear when we hear with our heart? We hear the cries of distress. The Psalms say, the Lord hears the cries of the poor. Well, do we, when the homeless person comes in, or any time, do we hear the cries of the poor? Do we hear the distress, of people across the globe who are oppressed, economically, politically, spiritually? Do we hear, well, the often silent cries, right? That requires a real attunement, a real sensitivity, a real attention of the ears of our heart. The silent cries of the poor, the silent cries of the planet as we keep destroying it. Those are cries that come from Mother Nature, if you will, that come from deep within reality. Do we hear that? These often inarticulate, primitive, but all the more expressive groans. Sometimes it's nothing but a cry. It can be expressed poetically, artistically, or just a groan. Back a few months when we had Black History Month, the then pastor of St. Charles Borromeo in Harlem was a black man and a Jesuit. He began his homily at St. Patrick's Cathedral by screaming the oppression of black people over centuries. It's just a cry. And of course, he startled everybody who was there. They're not used to this kind of expressiveness in a sacred place, It's disturbing, and it should be. Do we hear it? How loud does it have to be before we hear the cries of oppression, dating back centuries in many cases, or just welling up from the human need now? Do we hear that? Did we hear the groans deeply enough? Or are we just listening to babble all day long? Our own inner babble or the outer babble or whatever, to distract ourselves from what's really being expressed all around and within us. Then, as I say, there's a connection between what we hear and then what we speak. So what then do we speak? Do we have an impediment in our speech in the sense that we can't respond as we ought to, as we're called to? And how are we called to respond? Well, with compassion. Or are we just adding to the babble constantly in what we say? Or worse, on our social media or in person, are we adding to the fear and the paranoia and the hatred and the anger and all of that other stuff? We have an impediment in our speech if that's what we're doing. We need to be healed. St. Paul says in the New Testament, let every word that comes forth be for upbuilding. No word should ever come out of our mouth except what expresses compassion, hope, healing, forgiveness, justice, flourishing and growth and hope for our interlocutor or the human family or whatever the context in which we're speaking. Every word that we are so privileged to be able to speak as human beings with the power of speech should be for the upbuilding of the human family. If it's not, then cut it off before it even comes out. And that requires, of course, that we're very vigilant, go back to that silent place, inspect everything that is trying or is proposing to be said from our, and speak from the heart. And if it comes from deep enough in the heart, it will be a word of love and compassion. Even in the midst of suffering and agitation and provocation and all of that, which there's plenty of, do we not respond in kind? Repay evil with good, as Paul says. So what kind of impediment in our speech do we need to cure? And again, the word can be a single syllable. It can be a groan. It can be like a powerful word, a mantra, or almost a magic word. And that's what we see with Jesus in the gospel today, right? He's so physical. He puts the fingers in the ears and spits and touches the tongue. And he takes them apart from the crowd, by the way, which is what we have to do, right? That's what I've been saying. Come apart from the crowd and from all the babble and close the door and be with yourself and with the Lord in secret to see what really emanates or should be emanating from your heart. So Jesus takes them apart from the others, that is, and groans, right? Very striking. He looks up to heaven and groans. Sometimes sharing the groans of the poor and the oppressed is our best response. Weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. Express what's truly in your heart, and sometimes words can't contain it. It has to be a groan or a scream, as I say. Join with them. Let that be your response, and then move to action as appropriate. And then Jesus says, ephphatha. It's one of the few places in the Gospels that we have his original word, it would seem. It's Aramaic, it's his own language, and it means, as you heard, be opened. It's like a magic word almost, ephphatha. And that's what we need to hear from Jesus. Be opened. Let your heart be opened so you can hear and respond in a way that will bring healing and love to the world. Be opened. And then we can truly say that we do hear and we are able to speak. So let's focus on that. Ask the Lord to open the ears of our heart to hear the deepest and most authentic voices that cry out from the world. And then to respond from that same deep place in the heart to bring hope and healing. It can be scary to open your heart when there's so much there to wound it. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, yes, they can. So we know that. So to really be vulnerable, well, why do you think we have the Sacred Heart or the Immaculate Heart of Mary? Because they're hearts that are pierced with a sword. They're not afraid to let their heart be wounded and vulnerable, because from that flows the blood, the water, the compassion, the life, our lifeblood, our compassion to bring others, to bring joy to others. And that's our deepest identity. To be children of God and to reflect God's own action in the world, Christ's own action in the world as he acts in and through us. So what are you hearing? What are you saying? May the Lord open our hearts, and may we respond.